Okay, so we're going to continue and look at our last nutrient cycle. So this is called the nitrogen cycle. So again, nitrogen is an element, just like carbon is an element. So we're going to look to see how it basically transforms in different compounds that can be used by both living and then, of course, non-living items. Okay, so nitrogen is actually nitrogen gas. So let me just clarify something. So when we talk about nitrogen in the atmosphere, nitrogen in the atmosphere takes on a form of N2, okay, and that's a gas. So just like carbon dioxide, when it's in the atmosphere, that's the form that it takes on. This is the form of nitrogen in the air. And actually, about 80% of the air that we have here on Earth is made up of nitrogen gas. So a lot of people think that it's mostly oxygen or even carbon dioxide, but actually it's almost close to 80% of nitrogen. Now, it's important to know that this form of nitrogen that's in the air is actually not usable for living things. Just like humans cannot use carbon dioxide to create energy, humans cannot use nitrogen in the air to create energy. So what do we need it for? Why are we talking about this? So nitrogen is actually a main component. So it's an element that's very predominant in DNA, which is part of our genetics. Every cell in our bodies, every cell in every living thing's body has a DNA or a blueprint for the genetics, and proteins. So proteins are used for many different functions. But of course, when we think of protein, maybe you're thinking of, your muscle system, right? So proteins and our DNA are obviously very important. So nitrogen is a very important element. But the problem is, and then the point is made here, we cannot absorb the nitrogen that's in the air directly. We have to have it in what we call a usable form. So the usable form of nitrogen is this right here, and it's called a nitrate ion, okay? So you're not expected to know this formula, but you should know the term. So nitrogen in the air, we cannot use. Nitrogen in the air, we cannot use, okay? So we cannot use that. Nitrate is actually what we can use. So it's the nitrate ion that we're using for these two important things that we just finished discussing. So now let's talk about, well, how do we get it from this into the form that we need to use? And how does it get recycled back into the atmosphere? And that's really the goal of this. So the nitrogen cycle, here's a nice little overview. Obviously, we haven't talked about all of these parts yet. I'm going to come back to this picture at the end. But essentially, there are three kind of big ideas here. Okay, so remember that nitrogen that's in the air is right there. So there are three things. So one section is over here. So this is talking about how do we get this nitrogen into nitrates or the usable form. Okay, so this is called nitrogen fixation, and we will come back to this. But this is the first process we're going to be discussing. Okay, the second process we're going to be discussing is this guy right here, looking at the decomposer's role in nitrogen. Okay, and the third one that we're going to be looking at is, of course, we need to have this become a cycle. How do we get nitrogen back into the air? So it's a process called denitrification. So really we have three main processes. So this area over here, fertilizers, this is similar to when we talked about the burning of fossil fuels. This guy over here is our human activity that is interrupting this cycle. And we'll talk about this towards the end. But really, the natural process that happens with nitrogen is we take it from the atmosphere and we convert it into nitrates. The decomposers are going to have a huge role to play with reusing that nitrogen and then getting the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Because we're going to look at these at one piece at a time. Okay, so step one. So this is like our process one. So when I say one, I'm referring to this number one right here, okay? So number one, the process is called nitrogen fixation. So this is where we want to get nitrogen into that usable nitrate form. So remember, the air nitrogen is not usable. You can't really use that for anything. But the nitrate is what we want to make, what we need for our cells to function. Okay? So there are two ways that we can actually do this process, and both of them are natural. Okay, so one way is through atmospheric nitrogen fixation. The second way is through bacteria. Okay, so let's talk about each one of these. So the first one is actually done through a process in the atmosphere that uses lightning. Okay, so what happens is when there's a lightning storm, the energy that is in a lightning bolt essentially has enough energy to convert the nitrogen in the air into the nitrates that are now going to be into the soil. Okay, so once it rains, obviously usually lightning storms happen with rain or precipitation. So when the lightning converts the nitrates, it goes into the rain and then gets into the soil, which means then producers can use it in the soil, right, once the nitrates are there. Now, obviously this is a great process. It's natural, but it's not always raining, and we don't always have like a lightning storm happening. And plants need this, living things need this. Every living thing requires nitrates. So in terms of nitrate production, this actually only accounts for about 1% of the nitrate that we fix. So not very efficient, but it still happens. So the other, if 1% is coming from this atmospheric lightning, that means the other 99% of the nitrates are going to be converted with bacteria. Okay, so nitrogen fixing bacteria. So the goal, really what this bacteria does, is it takes the nitrogen from the air and converts it into the form that plants can use, which is that nitrate form. Okay, so do all bacteria do this? No, they're actually a special group of bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria. So it's kind of like a cluster of different types of organisms or bacteria that are able to do this. So bacteria, you're probably wondering, well, where do we find this bacteria? So the bacteria live predominantly in soil. Okay, so it's found. So remember, bacteria are small enough you can't see it with your naked eye, right? So they're found naturally in the soil. But there are certain plants that they love to live near. Okay, so the three plants that they like to, so they're found in the soil or in the roots of certain plants. So soybeans, peas, and clovers. Not like a 4-leaf clover, but like the typical 3-leaf clover, right? So they love, essentially those plants produce different nutrients that bacteria really thrives on. So they live right inside the roots of the plant. So the plant roots have these things called nodules. They look like almost like little grape clusters, but it's kind of like a house for the bacteria, which is kind of weird to say. All right, so imagine, here I have my, here's my 3-leaf clover. Probably should have made it green. And here are my roots underneath. So you have to imagine the bacteria are all over the place, right? So that nitrogen fixing bacteria live in the soil, right? But this is a plant that they really enjoy living near. So what will happen is they kind of start building a house or its habitat inside the roots of the plants. So you have to imagine the roots, they kind of look like they have this little like bubble on it or something, this little cluster. But inside of that cluster, it's packed with bacteria, okay? So packed with this nitrogen fixing bacteria. So what does that mean? It means that these types of plants actually have lots of nitrates available because they have lots of this bacteria living nearby. So you have to remember, these bacteria, or this group of bacteria, they account for 99% of the nitrates that exist in all of the world, right? The atmosphere is not really fixing a whole lot, right? The lightning is about 1%. So what we just discussed is this section right here. So taking nitrogen from the air and converting it into nitrates. So we can do that through lightning or through nitrogen fixing bacteria. Okay, so let's look at step number 2. So step number 2 is where we're going to be involving the decomposers. Okay, so what we're looking at here is when we have waste, so think of like, poo or pee or dead organisms. Okay, all organisms that are alive eventually will die. What happens is the decomposers will break them down, and we talked about that already. So anything that was once living, right? It's not like when you walk outside, there's a whole bunch of like dead rabbits or squirrels around. The bodies will decompose over time naturally. So the same thing happens to the nitrogen. So you have to imagine, right? Let's add in something here. So, I'm sorry for those of you who may have a rabbit at home. We're going to kill this rabbit. Okay, so this rabbit is happy, it's alive. You have to remember that inside its cells, right? So in the DNA and in its muscle cells, the proteins, there is nitrogen or nitrates, right? When this rabbit dies, okay, the decomposers are going to break this nitrate down. So you have to think, the dead, let's say the muscle, right? The muscle on this rabbit's leg. There's lots of nitrates inside of the muscle of any living thing. So what happens is we want to recycle that. Decomposers are going to help with the process